Welcome to Windows on the World, and a great show for you tonight. It's all about infiltration and manipulation with some lessons from history. So let's start with today. The Church of England have stated that they will be replacing the word church with community. Anything now called a community is not you or anyone you know. It is an imposition from above for a particular purpose which masquerades under the well-known term which appears to include you. Yes, community. Organised training of clergy in the church has rendered them to be merely instruments of the new communism and fake sustainable development plan. In other words, they are sold out empty shells full of sound bites, not learning or philosophy. Any inner power from a spiritual source has been officially removed under this new banner community. And this has been achieved through infiltration over the years. It has, however, been done through your consent. Did you object? Did anyone form a community to oppose it? There will be new societies forming outside this fake community where, of course, consensus is the word for everyone who appears to have agreed. When, of course, they didn't. To use a term circulated by puppet politicians, the church is being hollowed out. This is just one example. It, of course, has been infiltrated and every level of interaction and belief has been taken care of for you. You don't have to do anything, just go along with it and clap it along. Make sure you appear to be part of the community. This is similar to infiltration by any cult. Most parish churches have posters up inviting the community, which used to be a congregation, of course, to snitch on anyone they believe is not adhering to the new community doctrine. I went all over the country several years ago, and I do like visiting these old parish churches, and outside all of them were posters encouraging people to basically snitch under the banner, of course, of community and the respect for each other. This is actually communitarian law. And we are in the post-truth world. Infiltration and the placing of agents into all places of public society has been essential, and this has been going on for 15 years, but longer if you count the social movements since the First and Second World Wars. Community spies are very useful and always have been. During the Reformation, snitches working for Sir Richard Rich, who was a lawyer, and a duplicitous and self-serving snitch who would supply information on people who may be preaching or reading the Tyndale Bible in English, for example, as well, of course, as any malicious gossip about your activities outside the accepted narrative, which was the Act of 6 Articles, or an act called the Advancement of True Religion. Well, if you were in breach of any of this, then just the suspicion of talking outside the narrative would be enough to get you interrogated and basically isolated from that word community. So the new doctrine is all embedded in the word community. That's the point here. It's a clever move as there is now no competing group or groups visible. The community includes everyone, so they are not allowed to go outside it, and all are absorbed into one whole. A whole society is the community, who actually are assumed to be everybody. Whether or not you appear or have agreed is irrelevant. It's been done on your behalf, and throughout history this has been used in different ways, but never in such a scientific and direct way as at the moment. And people can see that with the so-called new Labour government, which came in the UK, for example. It's completely totalitarian, has nothing to do with what people thought were the principles of this party. So we have like a one-party state. The Conservatives, as we said, were enablers. They were a bit mixed up about it all. And Labour are the enforcers of this new system. So throughout history, for example, all of the not-so-secret societies are known to have two faces. They would have to be a real secret, of course, if they didn't. The public side is where the distractions of surface and community actions exist. We can see this in the outward display of community given by such associations as the Freemasons. Of course, not a secret society, as they say, a society with secrets. And the private side, of course, is where the real aims of the organisation remain hidden. But what about messiahs and messianic cults, where the followers are waiting for the Messiah? There are many thought leaders, from internet wafflers, of course, to the promoted ones who you see all the time. And these are all you are led to believe actually exist. So, in other words, if you don't scratch the surface and you don't dig deep, you will actually just be given what you are meant to be seeing. And tonight we're going to carry on from previous shows about infiltration through the sect known as the Donme, which is another word for apostates, as you will find out as the show goes along, and what are known as the Sabbatean Frankists. We've done quite a few shows on this, but the importance of this sect cannot be undermined, and in a way it is important to know this today, equally as important as it was during the 1600s and the 1700s, when Sabbatean Frankism was actually leading half the congregation of a certain religion. And when Messiah Zevi proclaimed himself Messiah in 1666, which is exactly what he did, he got away with it mainly because he was a convincing showman and storyteller. Masses of people do not follow studious and knowledgeable people. That's just a fact. They follow showmen or blatant liars who always make grandiose claims, and Zevi was particularly good at this. And of course, they have to have good PR abilities. They have to be good at self-promotion. In other words, they're very similar, or some of them are, or could be described as con men, as in gurus, and those promoted assets we see in the media. Well, the Kabbalists of the 13th century created legends and stories around themselves. For instance, the author of the Zohar, one of the most important books in Kabbalah, the author Moses de Leon, changed his name to Simeon ben Yochai because he knew that no one who knew him would buy his book, so he created an alter ego. And this is a much better way, as one can create a story and a legend around your character. The character, of course, which you have created, which would be much more difficult when people know who you really are. In order to seem immortal, there has to be a lot of hype and fuss based on stories. The more ludicrous, of course, the better. The cult of personality, of course, is not a new thing. It's been going on since time began. Just imagine that half the people following a long-term religious belief system worshipped what in reality was a clown who merely held a high opinion of himself and managed to persuade others of his importance. Well, even after Messiah Zevi was forced to denounce his previous status, he reinvented himself as a crypto-Muslim. Messiah Zevi created 18 commandments. The most revealing of them are the 10th. And that is that it is not permitted to introduce someone by force into the faith of the turban, that is Islam, even if that person believes, because he who belongs to the group of the Masters of War, also known as the Donme, enters therein with a full heart and by the will of the soul, without one's constraint of any fashion. So, in other words, everything was done with full consent of the followers. And this is, of course, after Messiah Zevi was forced to renounce Judaism and turn to Islam. So he actually wore a turban, but the inner man was still a Sabbatean Frankist, whereas the outer man was a Muslim. This is how they infiltrated communities. How consent is manufactured or steered is absolutely irrelevant. It is still a choice and has to be seen as one. Well, of course, all terrible oaths are entered into through your full consent. The 14th commandment of Messiah Zevi is that one secretly reads Psalms every day. That's very interesting, isn't it? Not privately, secretly. The 17th commandment is that Sabbateans would not marry Muslims, even though, of course, his followers all converted to Islam outwardly. So, they were only openly Muslims, but did not marry or interbreed with them. This obvious hypocrisy is not understood by those who do not have a public image covering their real intentions, which of course is the majority of the native population of everywhere. The Sabbateans go much further in their open hypocrisy. Well, even the Catholics who refused to take the oath of supremacy under Henry VIII took the oath superficially to avoid them being hung, drawn and quartered or other such cruel punishments. But they never hid or went against their Catholic beliefs. In other words, they didn't pretend that they were anything other than papists. They just made a concession to say that they recognised Henry as head of the church in England rather than the Pope. Well, getting on to more serious control, Messiah Zevi's Commandment 18 stated that Donme take care to circumcise their sons to remove the opprobrium of the holy people, that is, the physical foreskin. And the difference being then, of course, that Muslims more often circumcised after the age of 7 and sometimes after the age of 13, and that's an important difference. And this leads to some inner manipulation even within the cult of Sabbatean Frankism. So Sabbateans, the same as Jews, circumcised after only 8 days when the baby would be biologically mutilated in a way that causes lifelong trauma and involuntary mental instability for life. If the story is correct, this goes back to how the ancient controllers of the pharaohs, the Vratses, turned the captives of Judea into biological robots to serve them. It was to make their behaviour susceptible to triggers which would make them react predictably. A sort of functioning bio-robot which could be triggered using easy methods. The temporary blackout occurring after the violent act when the baby is at its most vulnerable and in need of protection shatters the open consciousness and creates lifelong mistrust. This, of course, leads to an ongoing neurosis which can become completely uncontrollable. Well, this blank spot or hole in the consciousness field can be used to control the mind of the person throughout their entire life. That moment of sheer pain and shock makes the baby lose its continuum of conscious awareness, which had been up to that point level and uninterrupted. And the short lifespan had been fully part of the consciousness field. Since birth, of course, the unified field up until the point of interruption. And the trust then between the baby and its mother was broken. And the Vratses knew this and deliberately bioengineered a group of people to be useful biorobots who could be controlled through neurosis. And this loss of trust that the mother would let this happen stays with the baby into adulthood, of course, and can be used to control the adult through its entire life. Everything has its outward and real purpose, the real and the stated goals. The blank spot where the pain occurs and the aftermath are from a lifelong programming. The real circumcision, actually, and the meaning of it, according to the ancient texts, going back to anything from 70 AD onwards, usually we are told that a lot of the early Christian writings come from the 200 to 400 AD period, of course. Well, we are not absolutely sure about this. And we have to remember, as a side issue, that the first Christian church in Britain was not 600 AD as the Romans tell us. It was 33 AD in Glastonbury. Getting back to this idea of control, the blank spot during this circumcision where the pain occurred and the aftermath are a lifetime of programming. Now, This is a physical and mental way of programming. But of course, there are other methods, and the use of a manufactured Messiah is yet another one. And we have to remember, of course, that the real circumcision that these ancient texts were talking about is that of the perfecting of the spirit and the advancement of the soul. Getting back to methods of control, they are achieved through physical methods mixed with psychological manipulation. So, in the 1700s and later into the 1800s, millions followed the cult known as Sabbatean Frankism. Their first self-proclaimed leader was, as we've said, Messiah Zevi, who proclaimed himself Messiah of the world in 1666. His followers believed that God would intervene and God would save the cult if they hastened chaos on the earth by deliberately bringing it about. So they got up to all sorts of nefarious activities. And of course, these people could openly lie about everything they did because their outer life was nothing to do with their inner life. They were basically acting as hypocrites within society. It was an extremist cult which included orgies and rituals which were outside the belief systems understood by the public within which they were a part of. This was their method of infiltration when Messiah Zevi had to convert to Islam. Then the followers converted to Islam, and the results of that were very obvious in the histories of the Middle East. We're going to be getting into that this evening. So it was an extremist cult which included these orgies and rituals, and millions followed Messiah Zevi. It was believed that at least half of the Jewish population of the planet followed Messiah Zevi. So he was born in Smyrna in 1626. Of course, that's modern-day Turkey. He was born a Jew, but when confronted by the prospect of execution, converted outwardly to Islam. And Messiah Zevi actually became the doorkeeper to the Sultan. He was like a kind of butler. And his followers were outwardly Muslim, but secretly Sabbatean, of course. They were known, as we've said, as the Donme. And Donme is actually a derogatory term, meaning apostate. Viewing it as a sacred mystery, Zevi's followers, they imitated his conversion to Islam, though secretly keeping their Kabbalistic doctrines. This is very important. They were first and foremost followers of Kabbalah. So see our shows, Clowns of Kabbalah, and the shows and articles which simplify this subject, which in the hands of wafflers is literally never ending. And the best book on the subject of Kabbalah is actually Kabbalah by Gershon Scholem. The Smart Cabal is the link which you will find all these articles and the shows about Kabbalah, which goes into Rosicrucian Freemasonry. You can see how it all links up through this article called the Smart Cabal. And you'll see how it's linked to Neom, this huge city which will probably never get built in the Middle East, which is going to house 500 million people and is 11 miles long and 500 meters wide. And we also talk of the House of Saud, the Saudi so-called royal families who are in charge of that region, and how they are connected high up through the Donme, through the Sabbateans, and through Islam. So in Europe, the Sabbateans were eventually led a century later, after the demise of Messiah Zevi, by Jacob Frank, who claimed to be a reincarnation of Messiah Zevi. And according to Rabbi Antelman in his work, which was called To Eliminate the Opiate, the Sabbateans had the Rothschilds as fellow cult members. The Sabbateans, therefore, had a hand in the founding of the Bavarian Illuminati. And this cannot be underestimated or undermined, as it was not one Illuminati lodge in Europe, which had a hidden and controlling hand in the French Revolution, of course, but many lodges. See our show Revolution for more on the Martinists, for instance, followers of Martinez de Pasquale and Louis-Claude de Saint Martin, and also the offshoot organisation, the Elected Priesthood of the Universe, also known as the Ellis Cohen, who are also Kabbalistic and indulge in theurgical magic. This is very important when we're talking about Kabbalah, because Kabbalah was all about mystery, fantasy, imagination and magic. So, in other words, when we focus on one lodge, such as the Illuminati Lodge of Adam Weishaupt, this is, in a way, an obvious distraction. They're getting people to focus on something that was allegedly disbanded. However, there were many more Illuminati lodges throughout Europe. Europe was full of Illuminati lodges, and they were operating under the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, which the Grand Orient Lodge of France incorporated themselves into. So every form of infiltration, therefore, has to be decentralised with many arms and many agents. This is how, of course, the Church of England has been infiltrated and taken over recently. In our article, and many linked shows, The Smart Cabal, which you can have a look at, go to winnersontheworld.net, you'll find tons of stuff in there. We explore the newfound global cooperation that is not actually new. And these shows explore what is behind the new globalists of the House of Saud. To understand the connection between the House of Saud, its Wahhabism, and its connections to an Arab and Jewish cult, we will look at the centuries-old political and economic influence of a group known in Turkish as the Donme, or apostates, and the Sabbatean Frankists. So, the Smart City Desert, this show we did, explores this link between Israel, Arabian Jews, and the House of Saud, and the Sabbatean Frankists, and the Donme. And who are the House of Saud, and what do they follow? Well, the House of Saud follow Wahhabism. And Wahhabism is a term used to describe the strict Muslim cult created by Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab during the 1800s. And it's an extreme form of Islam, and it's practiced in Saudi Arabia. And Westerners, of course, will be familiar with its beheadings and intolerant legal system. Getting imprisoned in Saudi is a hellish experience. I actually know somebody who was unfortunate enough to be wrongfully jailed, and he only got out because he had dual citizenship. He had British citizenship and German citizenship. The British did nothing to get him out. The Germans did get him out. And he said the place was a hellhole. There was mentally ill people defecating on the floor. There were people having psychotic episodes, and he was in there for 40 days, and he said he actually took a long time to get over it. So all of this is contradictory to the image projected through concrete jungles and consumer distraction, decadence, of course, as in Dubai and Doha. However, this cult has been useful to the West, and the House of Saud connects Zionism and Islam at the highest governing levels. Here we have the link with the Sabbatean Frankists. And as the show goes on, we'll get more into that. But if you want to know more about the Young Turks and Ataturk and the connection to the Donme, we will be mentioning that in this show. But go to that article, The Smart Cabal, and that's linked to pretty much everything that links the whole thing together, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this show. So the relationship that exists in the Middle East and the cooperation between seemingly opposing religions and agendas is explained through the similarity in objectives between extreme ideologies. And of course, both extreme ideologies, whether we're talking about Noahide law or Wahhabism, advocate stoning and beheading. And if it's true that Medina was a base for Jewish cultists and Mecca was for the Arabs, the connections make sense at this highest governing level, where religion is a side issue and business and power actually come first. So I hope you found this interesting so far. I'm going to take a very short break and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. And we're now going to talk about how the British have aided and abetted Wahhabism and the House of Saud. The governing Saudis and Kuwaitis cannot be strictly described as Arabs because of their connections. As for the Donme, they spread through the Middle East and Europe. The Young Turks, the uprising in Turkey, and Ataturk himself were not strictly Muslim, and their connections to both Judaism and the Donme puts the whole operation into proper perspective. For example, the author D. Mustafa Turan wrote in a publication called The Donme Jews that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism, was a descendant of a family of Donme Jews from Turkey. Does this start to make sense? Does this start to make sense in the global order of revolutions? It certainly does, doesn't it? When we look at the French and the Russian Revolution, particularly. And the Donme were descendants of followers of Messiah Zevi, even though, of course, Zevi outwardly converted to Islam. Jews still followed him. And of course, many had converted with him. Viewing it as a sacred mystery, Zevi's followers imitated his conversion to Islam, though secretly keeping to their Kabbalistic doctrines. In Europe, the Sabbateans were eventually led, a century later, of course, by Jacob Frank, who claimed to be the reincarnation of Messiah Zevi. And according to Rabbi Antelman in To Eliminate the Opiate, to them belonged the Rothschilds, as we said earlier, who had a hand in the founding of the Bavarian Illuminati. Well, the Young Turk movement evolved, which aided in the collapse of the Muslim Empire of the Ottoman Turks. There is evidence that Ataturk himself, the founder of the modern Turkish state, was, as we said, of Donme origin. And Turan, the author, maintains that Abdul Wahhab's grandfather, Suleiman, was actually Shulman, having belonged to the Jewish community of Bursa in Turkey. From there he settled in Damascus, where he also feigned Islam, but was apparently expelled for practicing sorcery. This was an interesting thing about the Kabbalists, because if they practiced sorcery, it was a miracle. If anybody else did, it was sorcery or witchcraft. So, Abdul Wahhab fled to Egypt, and he again faced condemnation, so made his way to Hijaz, where he got married and fathered Abdul Wahhab. This was his grandfather. According to this report, the same is claimed in the Donme Jews, which is another publication, and The Origin of the Saudi Wahhabis by Rifat Salim Kabar. So this is backed up by many authors, and it's also backed up by the historical timeline, because without it, it doesn't make much sense. But when we know this stuff, it all falls into place. So the notion of the Saudi family being of Jewish heritage has been published by Mohammed Sakir, who also claimed, and especially that he was ordered killed by the regime for his revelations. The report relates a similar account, but from different sources. According to the Wahhabi movement, and a book called The Truth and Roots by Abdul Wahhab Ibrahim al-Shamari, for example, Ibn Saud is actually descended from Mordecai bin Ibrahim bin Mushi, a Jewish merchant from Basra. Apparently, when he was approached by members from the Arabian tribe of Anitza, he then claimed to be one of them, just as Messiah Zevi had done previously, and travelled with them to Najd, and his name became Markham bin Ibrahim bin Musa. And if we take this a little bit closer to Northern Europe, we have the Mary cult in Ireland, which was the direct result of Sabbatean Frankists infiltrating the Catholic Church in Ireland. And we covered that in a show called The Irish Count. It's actually called They Warned You, The Irish Count. And you can see that in our archive. So let's have a look at the Wahhabi movement and when it started again, just to remind you. Ibrahim Ibn Wahhabi was born in 1703 and he died in 1792. He was a Sunni Muslim scholar. He was a theologian, a preacher, an activist, a religious leader, a jurist and reformer from Najd in Central Arabia. That's according to the most mainstream sources. And he was the founder of the so-called Wahhabi movement. So, if we take a look at the present, the Sabbateans had a base in what is now modern-day Thessaloniki. Salonika, as it was called at the time, was the base of Messiah Zevi and the Sabbateans. And today, at the centre of modern-day Thessaloniki, is a large Chabad Lubavitch centre. The Hasidim of Lubavitch are also Kabbalists, as they were Sabbateans. So let's now go to some more information. This is from My Jewish Learning, a website. The rabbis of the Talmud went so far as to introduce specific prohibitions against Messianic agitation, instituting what they called the Three Oaths, which prohibited any attempt to force the end times by bringing the Messiah before his allotted time. This is actually in the Babylonian Talmud. It's called Ketubot 111a, so you can look that up in the Babylonian Talmud. Yet in the mid-17th century, belief in the false Messiah, Messiah Zevi, spread like wildfire through the Jewish world, sweeping up entire communities and creating a crisis of faith unprecedented in Jewish history. And according to authors such as Gershon Scholem, the modern-day Judaism never recovered from the Sabbateans. Messiah Zevi was said to be born on the 9th of April in 1626 to a wealthy family of merchants in Smyrna, which is now Izmir in Turkey. He received a thorough Talmudic education and still in his teens was ordained as a Chacham, a member of the rabbinic elite. However, Messiah Zevi was interested less in Talmud than in mysticism. And he started in his late teens and studied, attracting a group of followers whom he initiated into the secrets of, yes, wait for it, the mystical tradition. He was a follower of Kabbalah, where man becomes not only one with God, but sees himself alongside God, viewing what is known as the divine household. We have gone into the different branches of Kabbalah, from the tree of life to gematria, the decoding of words through a numerological system, and we have gone into the visions of Ezekiel and the chariot in the sky where you sit alongside God. Lots has been written about Kabbalah and it will never stop. It's an endless sea of waffle guaranteed to take you nowhere, which is probably one of the purposes of it. So a follower of Kabbalah, where man becomes not only one with God, but sees himself alongside God, Messiah Zevi battled with what may now be diagnosed as severe bipolar disorder. He understood his condition in religious terms, however, experiencing his manic phases as moments of illumination and his times of depression as periods of falling from grace, when God's face was hidden from him. While at times of depression he became a semi-recluse, and when illuminated he felt compelled to contravene Jewish law, perform bizarre rituals called ma'azim zari, or also known as strange acts, and publicly pronounce the prescribed name of God by pronouncing the Tetragrammaton. In 1648, Messiah Zevi declared himself to be the Messiah, but did not make much of an impression on the Smyrna community, which had become accustomed to his eccentricities. So this is incredible, isn't it? You've got somebody who's clearly unbalanced, a bit of a bullshitter, and known as a local eccentric. And when he announces he's the Messiah in Smyrna, they say, yeah, we've heard it all before. However, on a global scale, it went massive. That's how this stuff works. Nonetheless, the rabbis had banished him from his hometown, and he spent much of the 1650s travelling through Greece and Turkey. He was eventually expelled from the Jewish communities in Salonika, modern-day Thessaloniki, and Constantinople, which is now, of course, Istanbul, for violating the commandments and performing blasphemous acts. So he was a thoroughly unbalanced individual. These days, of course, he would be termed severe bipolar and probably put on lithium. But in the 1660s, he arrived in Egypt via Israel, and during this period, he led a quiet life, displaying no messianic pretensions. The turning point in his messianic career came in 1665 as the result of a meeting with his self-appointed prophet Nathan of Gaza, a well-known Kabbalist, also known as Nathan the Prophet and Zevi the Messiah. That's Sabbatai Zevi the Messiah. So Nathan the Prophet created Zevi the Messiah. Nathan was a Kabbalist who Sabbatai Zevi approached for a mystical remedy to his spiritual malaise. In other words, he was on a downer, so he went to see Nathan. Nathan tried to convince Sabbatai of his messianic identity. Having had this secret revealed to him in a vision, and during 1665, he publicly announced the appearance of the Messiah, which was, of course, Sabbatai Zevi. Zevi was not, of course, the Messiah, but this must have seriously boosted his ego and aided his fantasies. During his next period of illumination, Sabbatai consented to these claims and initiated his own messianic career. And it has to be said that he didn't hide his light under a bushel basket. He was a show-off, he was an eccentric, he did anything, it seems, to gain attention. And he would say things, and this is recorded, to his congregation, his community, that he could fly. He had supernatural powers. But when people asked him to demonstrate these supernatural powers and actually start flying, he said, well, you're not worthy of seeing such a feat. And people still believed him. Most rabbis opposed him, however, but aside from issuing writs of excommunication and banishing him from Jerusalem, they actually took no action against him. Nathan of Gaza, however, initiated a mass movement of repentance, fasting and ascetic acts to prepare the way for the coming redemption. A cult was born in the same fashion as cults before and since, of course. A self-proclaimed Messiah appears, the gullible follow, and the cult grows until the Messiah is unveiled as a charlatan or messes up so badly that even his followers turn away. In September 1665, he announced that a fundamental cosmic shift... Hey, does that sound familiar? I wonder who said that before, a fundamental cosmic shift. We've got a few Sabbatai Zevis around at the moment, haven't we? A fundamental cosmic shift had taken place, and that within the year, without war, Sabbatai Zevi would take the Turkish Sultan's crown and make the Sultan his servant. Well, in reality, it was actually the other way around. And after that, Zevi would bring back the lost tribes of Israel and marry Rebecca, the daughter of the resurrected Moses. Yes, they actually believed it. The Sultan would then rebel, and the ensuing war would usher in the tumultuous birth of the Messiah. In other words, chaos would be created and the Messiah would appear, rather than the Messiah creating the chaos, which is what actually happened. In the same month, Sabbatai Zevi travelled to Aleppo in Syria and Smyrna, of course in modern-day Turkey, amidst an atmosphere of religious agitation. Several sightings of Elijah were reported, so we probably had a lot of mass hallucinations here. Incidentally, the last time this happened was in the 1800s in North Wales, and there were mass visions of lights in the sky, and there is actually a publication which I may do a show on called Psychological Aspects of the Welsh Revival, which you may find interesting. It shows how a community gets caught up into mania. Getting back to this, rabbis and communal leaders were swept up in the excitement of Sabbatai Zevi. When Zevi reverted to a state of ecstasy and began performing Masim Zarim, the miracles, the rabbis tried to stop him, but by then it was too late. He was over his downer and he was on the way back up again. With his followers, he stormed the synagogue of his opponents and called up family members and friends, including women, to the reading of the Torah and had them pronounce the divine name in their blessings. Remember that he had publicly uttered the Tetragrammaton, something which is not meant to be publicly uttered. So comparing his rabbinical opponents to unclean animals, he declared himself the anointed one of God, as any good cult leader would do. He had many fantasies, including telling people he could do all sorts of outlandish and ridiculous things, including, of course, that he could fly, as we've said earlier, but there was a lot more to it. He was actually out of the box most of the time. His behaviour was really extreme. He had many fantasies, of course, and they were projected onto the world. So now we get on to the section where the public embraced the Messiah. Messianic fervour began to spread throughout the communities of the diaspora. Repentance, extreme asceticism, scourging and fasting alternated with periods of ecstatic joy. He got them at it, basically. Messianic prayers written by Nathan of Gaza were published. Zevi, it seems, couldn't have found a better PR man than Nathan of Gaza, the Kabbalist. While some Jews began to make travel plans for their imminent departure to the land of Israel, others refused, believing that they would miraculously be transported there on clouds. In other words, like a rapture was going to happen. What made the Jewish world so receptive to the false messianism of Messiah Zevi, though? Well, the belief in centuries-old persecution and a lot of paranoia amongst communities of Jews would certainly have helped a lot. But Sabbateanism influenced communities all over the Jewish world. More importantly, on a governance level, it achieved infiltration of Catholicism and even Protestantism in Ireland and throughout Europe and Britain. Anyone can seem like anything on the surface. Again, the real versus the stated goals. The movement's popularity must be understood, though, in its theological context. The 16th century had seen the development of a popular new religious movement emanating from the town of Safed in northern Israel. This movement was Lurianic Kabbalah. Lurianic Kabbalah is a school of Kabbalah named after Isaac Luria, born in 1534, died 1572. The Jewish rabbi who developed it was Isaac Luria. Lurianic Kabbalah gave a new account of Kabbalistic thought, mixed with the Zohar of the 13th century by Moses de Leon, or also known as Simeon ben Yochai. And Lurianic Kabbalah describes new doctrines of the origins of creation. The creation story is very big in this, and the concepts of Olam ha-Tohu, the world of Tohu or chaos, and Olam ha-Tikkun, the world of Tikkun or rectification, which represents two archetypal spiritual states of being and consciousness. These concepts derive from Isaac Luria's interpretation of and mythical speculations on references in the Zohar. So the Zohar of the 13th century is an incredibly important book to Kabbalists. So this Kabbalistic waffle came from the overheated and megalomaniacal brains of those with a lot of time on their hands and big egos. If this wasn't the case, it certainly appears to be when you wade through some of it. We have to remember, of course, that Kabbalah was born in the Languedoc in the early 1300s in France. The new doctrine held that the creation of the world had sent the presence of God into exile, shattering the divine light into countless sparks and concealing them within the shells of mundane reality. This is a massive part of this Kabbalistic belief system. It actually drives you to, I wouldn't say despair, I would say closer to boredom than illumination. That is my own experience of it, which is why I wanted to put articles together which would save all of the waffle and get straight to the point. And I think we've done that. And that is backed up by authors such as Gershon Sholem, who did the definitive works on not only Messiah Zevi and Sabbatean Frankism, but also of course, Messiah Zevi and the Kabbalah. And by uncovering and raising up these sparks through mystical prayer and ritual, the redemption would come, not only of the Jewish people, but of the cosmos and of God himself. So even God would be redeemed through the Lurianic Kabbalah and the later works of Messiah Zevi and Jacob Frank. Whereas previously, Kabbalah had been speculative and esoteric, it was now a popular movement shot through with messianic tension. The appearance of a Messiah who, by contravening Jewish law, could descend into the depths of sin to redeem the last of the sparks, invigorated Jewish people with the sense that the end of the exile was at last at hand. So in other words, they bought into a prophecy through a con man. If Messiah Zevi's initial reception was conditioned by these religious factors, once inaugurated, the movement then took on a momentum of its own. It became a separate entity from Zevi, an egregor, a self-governing entity that still exists to this day. And those that claim nowadays to adhere to this cult actually know little or nothing of these writers, or indeed the real origins of Kabbalah in the Languedoc of the 13th century. Well, do you really think Madonna knows anything about this stuff? Of course not. Do you really think people who go to the Kabbalah Centre in America and pay vast amounts of money to hear this waffle know anything about this? Well, of course not. Because it's all about feel good. It's all about me, me, me. It's all about what can I do to get what I want. They've basically turned it into a New Age cult. But in many communities, the anti-Sabbatean minority, including many rabbis, were careful not to antagonize their congregations for fear of terror and reprisals. In other words, the Jewish communities had been interpenetrated and infiltrated with Frankists, and those within these communities would become scared of speaking out. This is the controlling method of all extremist cults, and this one had infiltrated Jews and Muslims. A very useful device, of course, in the wrong hands. Thus, any effective opposition was easily neutralised. So, let's now get back to Messiah Zevi. In 1666, Messiah Zevi was arrested in Constantinople after a period of imprisonment during which he held court as Messiah. You can imagine him in prison, can't you? He replaced the fast of the 9th of Tisha B'Av with a festival celebrating, what else? His birthday. And begun to sign his letters, "I am the Lord your God, Messiah Zevi." No modesty on show whatsoever here. He was denounced, however, for fomenting sedition, and he was brought before the Sultan. And according to the official narrative, upon arriving in Constantinople in February 1666, Sabbatai had been imprisoned on the order of the Grand Vizier Fazil Ahmed Pasha, and in September of that same year, after being moved from different prisons around the capital to the imperial court seat in Adrianople, which is now Edirne in Turkey, he was judged on accusations of fomenting sedition. Sabbatai Zevi was given the choice of either facing death or converting to Islam publicly. And this was done under the supervision of the Grand Vizier representing Sultan Mehmed IV. He chose, of course, to convert to Islam, donning a turban from that time on, and becoming the Sultan's doorman, a bit like a sort of Parker and Lady Penelope kind of situation, I would suggest. Not wishing, of course, to undermine the importance of the Messiah here. The heads of the Ottoman state then rewarded him with a generous pension for complying with their political and religious plans. About 300 families who followed Zevi also converted to Islam and became known as the Donme. They are still in existence today, but as they are a secret sect, their influence cannot be officially measured. Well, subsequently, the Ottomans banished him twice, first to Constantinople, and when he was heard singing psalms with Jews to a small town known as Ulcini in present-day Montenegro, he was again castigated, and he died in Montenegro. And Zevi, as we've said, was a bit of a clown and is described as being bipolar. And of course, when in a depressive state, he denied even making his messianic claims. So this person was actually seriously mentally ill. So after he chose to convert to Islam, Sabbatai became Aziz Mehmed Effendi, and with a royal pension, he lived until 1676, outwardly as a Muslim, but secretly participating in the Sabbatean rituals. His letters revealed that at the time of his death, he still believed he was the Messiah. Well, of course, egomaniacs never back down, and once you say you're the Messiah, what can you say? I've made a mistake? You're not going to do that, are you? After his crypto conversion, he was actually the Sultan's doorman, a sort of Islamic butler. So the story really is, to anyone with a sense of humour, quite comedic. But Sabbateanism is quite a serious matter and became a tool of global infiltration and subversion. While Sabbatai Zevi's conversion created a crisis of faith for most of his followers, the movement actually lived on, sustained by esoteric Kabbalistic explanations for the apostasy and by its adherents' psychological need to prevent their deep-seated religious world from falling apart. So their worldview was protected by their conversion to Islam. Well, Kabbalah and its clowns and wafflers have a lot to answer for, but of course they're too busy making stuff up to take any responsibility for their own actions. Well, the movement survived into the early 18th century when the Sabbateans divided into two camps: the moderates, who combined their secret messianic faith with adherence to Jewish law, and the radicals, who set about covertly spreading the heretical doctrine that was the Frankist worldview, which was a rejection of religious law as ineffectual and repressive, and focusing on the supernatural, the esoteric, and the magical world. In other words, a world of their own. Sabbatean Frankists and Kabbalah influenced the formation of new version of Jewish mysticism, which appeared in the 1800s, which was known as, and still known as, the Hasidic movement, which was actually born in late 18th century Poland. And its main public-facing society is the Chabad Lubavitch. And they are Kabbalists and were very influenced by Sabbatai Zevi. So now let's get on to the later Sabbateans. Joseph Frank, the reincarnation, or the self-defined reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi. So, the Zoharite Jacob Frank, real name Jankiu Leibovich, founded the Jewish Sabbatean Frankists. He was born in Poland in 1712 and preached a new doctrine based on that of Sabbatai Zevi. He was arrested by the rabbis and liberated through the Roman Catholic clergy. This is very important. This is where the infiltration of Ireland and the Mary cult actually came from. Ever wondered why there's so many Mary statues in Ireland? And how the Mary statues were put everywhere within certain sections of the Catholic doctrinal faith? Well, this was Sabbatean influence. Of course, anything but put Jesus up there. So, of course, he was allowed, Jacob Frank, to preach his doctrine, and he even accepted Christianity. His followers were known as Zoharites, following the Zohar of Moses de Leon. And his sect became more popular in Poland and Bohemia, especially until he died in 1791. And their followers formed Masonic lodges, which spread through Turkey, as we know, called the Donme. The main ideas were that the Messiah would return if there was enough evil in the world. Moshiach comes when there is chaos, so that Sabbateans create as much as possible. Sabbatai Zevi and Jacob Frank have divided Jews and their followers and continue to do so and create their chaos through Freemasonry and any other outlet they can use. This cult is not reformed Judaism, it is deformed Judaism, all through the Kabbalah and its deception and its fantasy. The religious side of traditional Judaism, a temple, an altar with animal sacrifice and a Messiah, is bypassed with the cult of Frankism. The Sabbatean Frankists recruit outside Judaism and have assimilated into Islam and Christian cults, masquerading also through the doctrine of the Rosicrucians, who accept and practice Kabbalistic thinking and concepts. This was also very influential in the Enlightenment period, with Kabbalah being accepted by so-called Christian mystics. The Sabbatean cult deny they are members of the cult and carry on with the reversal of natural law. It is a large clique who promote each other. Authors who have written about the Kabbalists and the Sabbateans include, of course, Gershon Scholem. We've mentioned him a few times, but his stuff is worth looking at. Now, we're going to have a few quotes. This is from the Kabbalah, Its Influence on Judaism and Christianity by Bernard Pick, written in 1913. It must be noted that the Kabbalah intended to oppose philosophy and to intensify religion, but by introducing heathenish ideas, it grafted on Judaism a conception of the world which was foreign to it and produced the most pernicious results. In place of the monotheistic biblical idea of God, according to which God is the creator, preserver and ruler of the world, the confused, pantheistically coloured, heathenish doctrine of emancipation was substituted. The belief in the unity of God was replaced by the decade of the 10 Sephiroth, which were considered as divine substances. By no longer addressing prayers directly to God, but to the Sephiroth, a real Sephiroth cult originated. So this thing spread, and we can see the results of that now. We see these pop stars who are vacuously talking about Kabbalah, who know nothing of it, but are being directed by the cult. And this is all about disempowerment through, yes, the New Age and me. The focus on the self rather than the progression of the self. So the influence of the Donme and the Kabbalists carries on in the Middle East and beyond. So do look at the Smart Cabal, go to windowsonaworld.net, put that into the taskbar and it will come up. We talk of the smart city desert of Neom and the link between Israel, Arabian Jews and the House of Saud. And we also have Wahhabism, as we've said, a term used to describe the strict Muslim cult created by Abdul al-Wahhab, who lived 1703 to 1792. And the Wahhabis dominate Saudi Arabia, with also significant influence and presence in the United Arab Emirates, of course, Oman and Kuwait. Aided and abetted, of course, by the Western matrix and axis of power. This extreme form of Islam is practiced in Saudi Arabia, and Westerners will be familiar, of course, with its beheadings and the intolerance system. However, this cult has been useful to the West, and the House of Saud connects Zionism and Islam at the highest governing levels. It's worth repeating that. That's one of the main takeaways from this show. The relationship that exists in the Middle East and the cooperation between seemingly opposing religions and agendas is explained through the similarity in objectives between extreme ideologies. This has been exploited for the globalist objectives, of course. If it is true that Medina was a base for Jewish cultists and Mecca was for the Arabs, the connections make sense at this highest governing level, where religion is a side issue and business comes first. The British have aided and abetted Wahhabism and, of course, the House of Saud. The governing Saudis and Kuwaitis cannot be strictly described as Arabs because of their connections. As for the Donme, they spread through the Middle East and Europe, as we have talked about in this show. The Mary cult in Ireland was the direct result of Sabbatean Frankists infiltrating the Catholic Church in Ireland through Jacob Frank's daughters. Have a look at Eva Frank and do take a look at that show. They warned you, the Irish Count. The Count we're talking about is Count Noble Plunkett, who was an Irish nationalist who opposed this infiltration. So, we're now going to get on to another Sabbatean. Before that, I am going to have a very short break. Welcome back to Windows on the World. Quite a long show tonight because there's a lot of material in here for those who find it interesting. We're now going to talk about a present-day Sabbatean, a whistleblower of sorts. And his name is Ilgaz Zorlu, a present-day Sabbatean who's gone public and wrote a revealing book on his Sabbatean roots called Yes, I Am a Salonican. Let's see what this website says. It's from the millenniumreport.com. Dated 2016, Turkey's Donme Jewry and their Sabbatean roots. There is one place where Ilgaz Zorlu finds peace, a secluded cemetery in the Üsküdar district across the Bosphorus on the Asian side of the city of Istanbul. At first it looks like an ordinary Muslim cemetery, but Zorlu and his companions begin to point out the small differences. Many of the tombs are covered by a concrete surface, not earth, and have pictures of the deceased on them. These are not Islamic customs, and many of those buried here, he explains, are not Muslims, they're Sabbateans, members of a community descended from Jewish followers of the 17th century self-proclaimed Messiah, Messiah Zevi. To afford execution by the Sultan Zevi, as we know, converted to Islam in 1666. The most extreme of his followers also did so, practicing Islam outwardly and their strange form of Judaism in secret. A Judaism that supposedly included ritual adulterous orgies. Until this century, the sect was concentrated in the city of Saloniki, present-day Thessaloniki. Today, most Sabbateans actually live in Istanbul. And everyone in Istanbul, so it seems, knows about the Sabbateans, or as they are known here, the Donme, converts or apostates in Turkish. The Sabbateans themselves dislike this title and seldom, of course, use it. They are perhaps Turkey's best known secret. No Sabbatean, with the exception of Ilgaz Zorlu himself, will ever publicly admit to being one, and they are rarely talked about. Even the Sabbateans themselves learned their identities only when they turned 18, when the secret was finally revealed to them by their parents. This tradition of zealously maintaining a double identity in Muslim society has been passed on for generations of Sabbateans. So, it is a self-perpetuating society of secrets. They are Muslims, as their identity cards reveal, but as Zorlu puts it, all the Muslims know we're different. Their elders speak Turkish in an accent heavily flavoured by Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish of the Sephardic Jews. Their beliefs and rituals are largely unknown to outsiders, and they rarely go to mosques. They marry mainly among themselves and live in the neighbourhoods on the European side of Istanbul called Nisantazi, Sizli and Haskoy. These are the three places where they live, where most of the city's Jews also reside. But of course, they're not Jews either. They are Sabbateans. The Jewish community want nothing to do with them. He says, as far as we're concerned, this is the rabbi there, Rabbi Yitzhak Haliva, Deputy Chief Rabbi of Istanbul. There are only Jews and Muslims. There is nothing in between. Sabbatean leaders are convinced that Zorlu's disclosure has put the community into jeopardy. Well, Zorlu proves that once in a generation, a cult member is willing to speak out. As we know, the Donme community of Turkey were concentrated in the city of Salonika, which is present-day Thessaloniki in Greece, which became a hotbed of Masonic activity from which the Young Turk movement evolved, which aided in the collapse of the Muslim empire of the Ottoman Turks. And there is evidence, as we've said, that Ataturk himself, the founder of the modern Turkish state, was of Donme origin. Well, we know that Abdul Wahhab's grandfather, Suleiman, was actually Shulman, having belonged to the Jewish community of Bursa in Turkey. So here we see how it all comes together. And for them, from there, Abdul Wahhab settled in Damascus, where he feigned Islam, but he was apparently expelled for practicing sorcery. He then fled to Egypt. He again faced condemnation, so made his way to Hijaz, where he got married. And this was actually the grandfather of Abdul Wahhab. And we have to go back into this family to see its connections with the Donme and, of course, the Sabbateans. Well, according to the report, the same is claimed in the Donme Jews and the origin of Saudi Wahhabis by Rifat Salim Kabar. So we've got a lot of stuff here that ties everything together. So, to understand the connection between the Donme, Sabbateans and the Wahhabis in Saudi, this information is essential. The Sabbatean cult believes that the earth was without form, creation began in chaos, and out of chaos emerged the order. So this is the order out of chaos that we also see in occult Freemasonry. And the two proponents of this were Messiah Zevi, 1626 to 1676, Jacob Frank, 1726 to 1791. And to conclude, the Sabbatean Frankists, the Kabbalists, Messiah Zevi and Jacob Frank, believed that the more chaos and reversal of natural law, the sooner that God would intervene. They both claimed messianic status and gained huge following worldwide. So the connection at the top of the Cabal are not just business. So take a look at our article and shows also in Clowns of Kabbalah, and you'll find lots of articles of interest there, including Sabbatean roots of Turkish Donme, Wahhabi, Jewish origin, and you'll have a look at the executions in Saudi, which are typical of the cult. So, there have been plenty of self-proclaimed messiahs. There are messianic cults. There have been plenty of dates for an apocalypse, predictive, of course, and never occurring. However, in these days of global planning and control, strictly through financial institutions and corporate partners, of course, the puppets they place in power are the more likely method of control. Characters like Zevi will always and have always existed. The New Age and so-called newly awakened are susceptible to numerous Sabbatai Zevis. In fact, there is no difference in the reverence given to New Age charlatans, except the New Agers, of course, are too unfocused to follow one set of rules. Theirs is the endless stream of changing beliefs under one inclusive banner of hopium. The internet is full of such charlatans competing for attention. Without inner knowledge and self-development through discipline, all are susceptible to believe pretty much anything. So, in conclusion, those who appear as something they are not will always be found out eventually. And that is especially true today. The fork in the road has never been more clear than it is at the present time. And this is a good thing and means those swept away into the wilderness of the mind are doing so with their full consent. Therefore, they have no one to blame but themselves. And remember, the choice always was and always will be yours. I hope you found that useful and interesting. A lot of information there, a little bit of repetition to get it across. And you can look at the Smart Cabal at windowsontheworld.net, and all of the links are in that article and shows to the Kabbalah, Joseph Frank, the Sabbateans, Messiah Zevi and the Wahhabis. And of course, to this latest project, which actually ties a lot of it together, called Neon, this smart city that's allegedly being built in the desert at this very moment. So do please continue to send in information to Windows on the World. You can support us on the homepage at Windows on the World, and you can join the £5 a month club, which helps to keep us going, by emailing me at info@windowsontheworld.net. So until the next show, thanks to everybody who supports us.